The wolf on the table was dying, and nobody in the room could stop the bleeding. Alira Voss shoved through the guards blocking the infirmary door, before anyone could question her, her healer's bag already open in her hand. 3 men in armor moved to grab her, but a sharp voice cut through the chaos. "Let her through." The voice belonged to Cassian Draven, the Alpha King of Blackthorn, and the room went still the moment he spoke. Alira didn't look at him. She didn't have time. She dropped to her knees beside the wolf, a young soldier named Edmund, who had collapsed an hour earlier, with black veins spreading up his arms, and pressed both hands against his chest. "He's not bleeding," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "This isn't a wound. This is poison." The physicians standing around the table exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man with trembling hands, admitted they had tried everything they knew. Bloodletting, herbs, prayer. Nothing had worked, and the young soldier's breathing was growing shallow. Alira ignored all of them. She pulled a small vial from her bag, uncorked it with her teeth, and forced 3 drops between Edmund's lips. Then she pressed her palm flat against his sternum and closed her eyes, letting her senses stretch into his body, the way her mother had taught her years ago, back when the world was smaller and safer. The infirmary held its breath. Somewhere in the dark of Edmund's blood, she found it. A thread of something foreign and wrong, spreading through his veins like ink in water. Not a bite, not a curse. A poison, built by someone who understood wolves well enough to target the one thing that made them strong. "Get me yarrow root, ground blood moss, and boiling water," she said without opening her eyes. "Now, not in 5 minutes. Now." Nobody moved. She opened her eyes and looked up, and this time she did see him. Cassian Draven stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were locked on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was younger than she expected for a king with such a fearsome reputation, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that came from a man who never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "You heard her," he said quietly. The room exploded into motion. For the next hour, Alira worked without stopping. She cleaned the poison from Edmund's blood the way her mother had taught her, slow and careful, layering herbs and pressure and warmth until his breathing steadied, and the black veins in his arms began to fade back to a normal, healthy color. When she finally sat back on her heels, her hands were shaking, and her dress was soaked through with sweat, but Edmund was alive. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and one of the younger healers actually wept with relief. Alira allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel proud, before the exhaustion hit her like a wave. "You saved him," Cassian said. He had crossed the room without her noticing, and now he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him properly. Up close, he was even more imposing, but there was something in his voice that surprised her. Not command. Something closer to wonder. "I did my job," she said simply, wiping her hands on a cloth one of the healers handed her. "Your job," he repeated, as if testing the word. "The finest physicians in my kingdom stood in this room for an hour, and could not identify what was killing him. You walked in and had an answer within minutes." "I've seen this before," Alira said, standing and stretching her aching back. "Border packs deal with poisonings more than the capital does. When you live close to enemy territory, you learn to recognize the signs quickly, or you bury a lot of people." Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't quite name it. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. He studied her the way a man studies something he doesn't fully understand yet, something he suspects might be more valuable than it first appeared. "What is your name?" he asked. "Alira Voss." "And where do you come from?" "Alira Voss." "Ashenford," she said. "A border pack 2 days' ride from here. My Alpha sent me when your messenger arrived, asking for anyone with healing skill. I didn't expect to find the Alpha King himself standing in his own infirmary." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I don't often trust the lives of my people to strangers. I wanted to see for myself who was capable of curing what my own physicians could not." "And what did you see?" "Someone who doesn't seem to care that she's speaking to a king," he said, and there was no anger in it, only a strange kind of fascination. Alira met his gaze evenly. She had grown up in a pack where survival mattered more than titles, where an alpha's authority was earned through action, not simply inherited through blood. She had no illusions about kings. Power did not impress her. Results did. With respect, she said, I came here to save a life, not to impress anyone. The healers around them had gone quiet, watching the exchange with wide eyes, clearly unused to anyone speaking so plainly to their king. Illyra noticed a tall man standing near the doorway, blond and sharp-eyed, watching the scene with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. She would later learn his name was Ro Ashby, the king's beta and closest advisor, but in that moment, she only registered him as another set of eyes in a room full of them. You're the first person in a long time to speak to me that way, Cassian said. Would you prefer I lied? No, he said, and this time the smile reached his eyes. I would not. Before she could respond, the older physician approached, with news that another wolf had fallen ill, in the eastern barracks, showing the same black veins and shallow breathing. Illyra's stomach dropped. If this was spreading, it wasn't an isolated poisoning. It was something deliberate, something planned. Take me to him, she said immediately, already gathering her supplies. Cassian didn't hesitate. I'll come with you. They moved quickly through the stone corridors of the castle, Illyra half a step behind the king, as guards and servants pressed themselves against the walls to let them pass. She barely noticed the grandeur around her, the towering ceilings and ancient tapestries, the weight of centuries pressed into every stone. Her mind was already racing ahead to the next patient, cataloging symptoms, searching for patterns. How many cases have there been? She asked as they walked. This is the second in the capital, Cassian said, but we've had reports from 3 other territories over the past month. Always the same symptoms. Always wolves in positions of some importance, though we haven't determined whether that's coincidence or design. It's not coincidence, Illyra said without hesitation. This poison is too specific to be random. Someone is targeting your pack deliberately, and they know enough about wolf physiology to make it look like illness rather than an attack. Cassian's jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something other than calm authority in his expression. Concern, maybe even fear, though he clearly worked hard to keep it from showing. They reached the eastern barracks to find a young female soldier named Grace, collapsed on her cot, her breathing already labored, the same black veins spreading beneath her skin. Illyra went to work immediately, grateful that she recognized the pattern this time, and could move faster than before. She barked orders for supplies, pressed her hands against Grace's chest, and began the same careful process of drawing the poison out before it could reach her heart. Cassian stood at the edge of the room again, watching, but this time he didn't simply observe. He knelt beside the cot and gripped Grace's hand, speaking to her in a low, steady voice, telling her to hold on, that help had arrived, that she would not lose her life today. It was such a small thing, a king kneeling on a barracks floor to comfort a common soldier, but it told Illyra something important about the man beside her. Whatever else he was, whatever reputation preceded him, he cared about the people under his protection. It took nearly 2 hours, but Grace survived, her breathing evening out just as Edmund's had. By the time Illyra finished, night had fallen outside the barracks windows, and her entire body ached with exhaustion. She sat back against the wall, letting her eyes close for just a moment, and when she opened them again, Cassian was crouched in front of her, offering a cup of water. You've saved 2 lives today, he said. There will likely be more before this is finished, Illyra replied, accepting the water gratefully. Whoever is doing this isn't going to stop after 2 attempts. Which is exactly why I need you, he said, and the shift in his tone caught her attention immediately. This was no longer simple gratitude. This was something more deliberate. I want you to stay in the capital, Illyra Voss. Not as a temporary healer sent to handle an emergency, but as my personal physician. You would have the finest quarters in the castle, more resources than you could imagine, and the authority to demand whatever you need to protect my people. Illyra set the cup down slowly, considering her answer. She could see the appeal of it, the temptation of unlimited resources, and a position of importance. But something in her resisted immediately, some instinct she couldn't quite explain. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but my place is with my own pack. Ashenford needs healers too, and I have people there who depend on me. I came to help with this specific crisis, and I will stay as long as I'm needed to solve it, but I can't stay permanently. Something flickered across his face, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it. You're refusing me. I'm explaining my priorities, she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. It isn't the same thing. He studied her for a long moment, and the silence stretched between them, heavy with something neither of them said aloud. Finally he nodded, though the movement seemed reluctant, as if he wasn't accustomed to accepting an answer he didn't want. Very well, he said, but I hope you'll reconsider before you leave. I'll help you find who's behind this poisoning, Alira said, standing and gathering her supplies. That much I can promise you. But my answer about staying remains the same. As she walked away to check on other patients, she felt his eyes following her the entire way, and though she didn't look back, she couldn't shake the strange, unsettled feeling that something had shifted in that room. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. She spent the following days moving between the infirmary and the barracks, treating 3 more cases of the poisoning, and working late into the night to identify its source. Cassian visited often, sometimes to check on the patients, sometimes, she suspected, simply to observe her work. He asked thoughtful questions about her methods, listened carefully to her explanations, and never once dismissed her expertise the way she had expected a king might. It was during one of these visits, 4 days after her arrival, that Ro Ashby finally approached her directly. She was cleaning her instruments in a quiet corner of the infirmary when he appeared beside her, his expression thoughtful. You've made quite an impression, he said. I'm only doing my job, Alira replied, echoing what she'd told Cassian on the first day. Ro studied her with sharp, assessing eyes, the kind of look that told her he missed very little. Perhaps, but you should understand something about the man you're working for. Cassian Draven does not offer permanent positions to strangers. He does not extend that kind of trust easily, and he certainly does not accept refusal gracefully. Yet here you are, having turned him down, and he hasn't sent you back to your pack. Should he have? That's precisely my point, Ro said, lowering his voice slightly. He should have. Any other healer who refused his offer would have found themselves escorted to the border within the hour. Instead, he's letting you stay, watching you work, asking after your opinions on matters that have nothing to do with medicine. I've served him for 12 years, Alira Voss, and I have never seen him behave this way toward anyone. Alira felt a small knot form in her stomach, though she couldn't say exactly why. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. Ro glanced toward the door, as if checking that they were truly alone, then leaned in slightly. No one has ever refused him, not the nobles who wanted his favor, not the warriors who wanted his approval. Not the healers, the advisors, the diplomats who have come through these halls seeking a place at his side. Everyone gives him what he wants, eventually, because that is simply how power works. You said no to him, twice now if I'm counting correctly, and instead of dismissing you, he keeps finding reasons to walk through that door. That doesn't mean anything, Alira said, though her voice sounded less certain than she intended. Perhaps not, Ro said, straightening up, but I've learned to pay attention when my king behaves unlike himself, and you, Alira Voss, seem to have that effect on him. He left her standing there with her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hand, his words settling over her like a weight she hadn't asked to carry. She told herself it didn't matter, that she had a pack to return to, and a life waiting for her outside these castle walls, that whatever strange fascination the king seemed to have developed was not her concern. But that night, lying awake in the small guest chamber they had given her, she found herself thinking about the way Cassian Draven had knelt beside a dying soldier's cot and spoken to her with such gentle steadiness, about the intensity in his eyes when he studied her across a room, about the reluctance in his voice when she had refused his offer. She thought about Ro's words, repeating them quietly to herself in the dark. No one has ever refused him. She didn't know yet what that meant for her, or for the man whose gaze seemed to follow her everywhere she went. But some instinct deep inside her, the same instinct that had once warned her away from dangerous poisons and failing hearts, told her that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she had bargained for when she rode into the capital 4 days ago. Outside her window, the castle grounds were quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the courtyard. Somewhere within those stone walls, a king, who was used to getting everything he wanted, lay awake as well, turning over the same unanswered question in his mind. Neither of them slept easily that night, though neither would have admitted why. The poisoning crisis was far from over. Somewhere out there, someone with knowledge of wolf physiology and a clear intent to harm the kingdom was still at work, and Alira knew her skills would be needed again before long. But beneath that urgent concern, something else had begun to take root, something she couldn't yet name, and wasn't ready to examine too closely. She closed her eyes and told herself that tomorrow she would focus only on the poison, on saving lives, on finishing her work so she could return home to Ashenford where things made sense. She told herself that the strange warmth she'd felt under Cassian Draven's gaze meant nothing at all. She almost believed it. The message arrived at Ashenford 3 weeks after Alira had returned home, carried by a rider whose horse looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. Alira recognized the royal crest on his tunic before he even dismounted, and her stomach tightened with a mixture of dread and something she refused to call anticipation. "The poison has spread," the rider said, breathless. "2 more wolves have fallen ill in the capital, and the physicians can't stop it. The king requests your assistance immediately." Alira had known this moment might come. The source of the poisoning had never been fully identified before she left, only contained, and containment was never the same as a cure. She gathered her supplies without hesitation, informed her Alpha of the situation, and rode for the capital within the hour, her mind already working through the possibilities of what new symptoms might be waiting for her. She expected to arrive and find herself thrown immediately into the infirmary, as she had been the first time. Instead, when she reached the castle gates, she found Cassian Draven himself waiting for her, standing beside his horse, as though he had ridden out to meet her personally, rather than sending a servant to escort her inside. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't expected, relief, perhaps, or gratitude, that went deeper than simple necessity. "Of course I came," Alira said, dismounting and handing her reins to a waiting stable hand. "You said lives were at risk." "I did." He studied her for a moment, the same intense focus she remembered from their first meeting, though something about it felt different now, warmer somehow. "Walk with me. I'll explain everything on the way to the infirmary." As they walked through the castle grounds, he told her that the 2 new cases showed the same symptoms as before, the black veins and shallow breathing, but this time the illness had progressed faster, suggesting whoever was responsible had refined their poison. His investigators had traced trace amounts of a rare herb called shadowroot in the blood of the victims, a plant that grew only in the northern mountains and required significant knowledge to prepare correctly. "Shadowroot," Alira repeated, frowning as she considered the implications. "That's not something a common enemy would know how to use. Whoever is doing this has training, possibly even healing knowledge of their own." "That's what worries me most," Cassian admitted. "This isn't the work of an outside threat. I believe someone within my own court may be responsible." The weight of that statement hung between them as they reached the infirmary doors. Inside, Alira found the 2 new patients in worse condition than any she had treated before, their breathing so shallow it barely stirred their chests, their skin cold to the touch despite the warm blankets covering them. She went to work immediately, drawing on everything she had learned in the weeks since her last visit, refining her own methods to counter the strengthened poison. It took nearly 6 hours of continuous effort, but both patients survived. By the time Alira finally stepped back from the second cot, her hands trembling with exhaustion, the sun had risen and cast pale morning light through the infirmary windows. Cassian had stayed the entire time, sometimes assisting with small tasks, sometimes simply present, his steady watchfulness, a quiet form of support she hadn't asked for, but found herself grateful for nonetheless. "You need rest," he said, guiding her gently toward a chair before her legs could give out beneath her. "I need to figure out who is doing this," she countered, though she allowed herself to sit. "You will. But not on an empty stomach, and no sleep. Even the finest healer in the kingdom needs to care for herself occasionally." Something about the way he said it, direct but not commanding, made her smile despite her exhaustion. "Is that an order, Your Majesty?" "Call it a strong recommendation," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in that same rare smile she remembered from before. Over the following days, Alira settled into a rhythm of treating patients, investigating the source of the poison, and spending increasing amounts of time in Cassian's company, as he insisted on being involved in every step of the investigation. She found herself surprised by how easily conversation flowed between them, how he asked genuine questions about her training and her life in Ashenford, how he listened without the distracted impatience she had expected from someone of his status. One evening, nearly a week into her return, they sat together in a quiet study, poring over records of who had access to the castle's herb stores. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room, and for a moment, the weight of the investigation seemed to lift, replaced by something quieter and more personal. "Tell me about Ashenford," Cassian said, setting aside the ledger he'd been reading. "It's small," Alira said. "Nothing like this place. We don't have grand halls or armies of guards, just people trying to survive close to dangerous borders, looking out for each other because there's no one else to do it." "It sounds like a place worth protecting." "It is," she said simply. "That's why I can't stay here permanently, even though I understand why you keep asking." Cassian was quiet for a moment, studying the fire rather than her face. "I've offered dozens of skilled healers a place in my court over the years. None of them refused. Most were eager for the prestige, the resources, the chance to serve a king, rather than a border village most people have never heard of." "I'm not most people," Alira said. "No," he agreed, finally looking at her again, his expression unusually open. "You're not. And I find that I respect you more for the refusal than I would have if you'd simply accepted." The admission surprised her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something neither seemed willing to name. Alira broke it first, standing abruptly and gathering the records spread across the table. "We should keep working," she said. "The sooner we identify who's responsible, the sooner more lives are safe." Cassian nodded, though she caught the flicker of something like disappointment in his eyes before he masked it. Of course. They returned to their investigation, and within another 2 days, a pattern began to emerge. Every victim had eaten from the same kitchen stores during a specific window of time, and access to that kitchen had been limited to a small number of staff members. Alira and Cassian worked through the list methodically, cross-referencing schedules and testimonies, until one name stood out clearly among the rest. A kitchen assistant named Victor, who had joined the castle staff only 2 months earlier, and whose background, upon closer investigation by Rowe and his men, revealed ties to a rival territory that had long resented Cassian's growing influence. When Victor was finally confronted, he confessed almost immediately, revealing that he had been sent to weaken the Blackthorn pack from within, targeting soldiers and officials in positions of importance to sow chaos and distrust, before an eventual larger attack. He was taken into custody, and within hours, the immediate threat had been contained. Alira felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. The crisis that had brought her back to the capital was finally resolved, the source identified and stopped before more lives could be lost. She should have felt only satisfaction in that moment, the simple pride of a job well done. Instead, standing in the castle courtyard, as the evening settled around them, she felt something far more complicated stirring beneath the surface. Cassian stood beside her, having just given orders regarding Victor's imprisonment, and when he turned to face her, the look in his eyes made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with medicine, or crisis, or duty. "You solved this," he said quietly. "Without you, we might never have identified the source in time." "We solved it together," she corrected. "Perhaps." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that the space between them felt suddenly very small. "Alira, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that this isn't about the position I offered you before. This isn't about resources or titles or anything you would gain by staying." Her heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't have said whether it was from anticipation or apprehension. "What is it?" "Stay," he said simply. "Not because I need a physician, though I do value your skill beyond measure. Stay because I want you here, because these past weeks working alongside you have shown me something I didn't expect to find, and I'm not ready to let that go simply because you have a village waiting for you 2 days away." The offer hung in the air between them, different from anything he had proposed before. This wasn't about her healing skills or the crisis they had just resolved. This was personal, direct, and it struck something deep inside her that she wasn't entirely prepared to confront. Alira took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts before she spoke. "Cassian, I understand what you're offering, and I won't pretend these past weeks haven't meant something to me too. But my life is in Ashenford. My purpose is there. I can't abandon the people who depend on me simply because the offer here has become more personal than professional. Disappointment flickered across his face, though he worked to hide it quickly, his expression settling back into the composed mask she recognized from their first meeting. I understand, he said, though his voice carried a weight that suggested he understood only reluctantly. I should return home tomorrow, Elira said gently. The threat here has been resolved, and Ashenford needs me as much as ever. He nodded, though the silence that followed felt heavier than any that had come before it. As she walked away toward the guest quarters, she felt his eyes on her the entire distance, and though she didn't turn back, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something unfinished behind her, something that would follow her all the way back to Ashenford, and refuse to let her rest. That night, as she packed her belongings for the journey home, she found herself replaying every moment of the past weeks, every conversation, every quiet glance across a crowded room. She told herself this was simply the natural result of working closely with someone through a stressful crisis, that the feelings stirring inside her would fade once the distance between them grew. But some part of her, the same part that had recognized the poison in Edmund's blood within minutes of walking into that first crisis, suspected the truth was far more complicated than she wanted to admit. The scream tore through Ashenford's morning quiet, sharp enough to send birds scattering from the trees along the village edge. Elira dropped the bundle of herbs she'd been sorting and ran toward the sound, her heart already pounding before she reached the source. A young boy named Oliver lay collapsed near the well, his mother kneeling beside him and shouting his name. Elira reached them in seconds, her healer's instincts taking over as she checked his pulse, his breathing, the color of his skin. Nothing seemed immediately wrong. No wound, no fever, until she noticed the faint tremor running through his limbs, and the way his eyes had rolled back beneath half-closed lids. He collapsed out of nowhere, his mother said, her voice shaking. One moment he was fine, running to fetch water, and the next, he simply fell. Elira worked quickly, checking his vitals more thoroughly, searching for any sign of injury or illness she recognized. When she found nothing conclusive, worry began to gnaw at her more insistently. She had spent enough time around unexplained sickness recently to feel the hair on her arms rise with unease. Over the following days, 3 more villagers fell ill, with the same sudden collapse and trembling limbs, though none showed the black veins that had marked the poisoning in the capital. This was something different, something Elira couldn't immediately identify despite consulting every text and remedy she knew. She treated the symptoms as best she could, managing the tremors and keeping her patients stable, but the underlying cause remained frustratingly elusive. It was on the 5th day, while she sat exhausted at her small kitchen table trying to piece together a pattern from her notes, that a familiar sound reached her ears. Horses, several of them, moving fast along the road that led into Ashenford. She stood and moved to her window, watching as a small group of riders approached, and her breath caught when she recognized the man leading them. Cassian Draven had come himself, without warning, riding at the head of a small escort that included Ro Ashby and 2 other guards she didn't recognize. Elira stepped outside as they reined in their horses, confusion and something warmer she couldn't quite suppress, mixing together in her chest. "What are you doing here?" she asked, though the question came out gentler than she intended. Cassian dismounted, and she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, that suggested he hadn't slept well in some time. Word reached the capital of an illness spreading through the border territories. Similar symptoms have appeared in 2 other packs near your position. I wanted to see the situation myself, and I wanted to make certain you had every resource available to you. You rode 2 days for this, she said, still trying to process his presence standing in her small village. I would have ridden further, he said simply, and the honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Ro, standing slightly behind his king, caught Elira's eye and offered a small, knowing smile that she chose to ignore for the moment. There would be time later to address whatever unspoken understanding passed between the beta and herself. Right now, there were sick villagers who needed answers. She led Cassian and his party to the small building she used as an infirmary, where her 4 patients lay in various states of distress. Cassian moved through the room with the same careful attention she remembered from the capital, kneeling beside each patient, asking quiet questions, offering words of comfort even to strangers who had no reason to expect kindness from a king they'd never met. "These symptoms," he said after examining Oliver, who remained the sickest of the four, "they don't match the shadow root poisoning from before." "No," Illyra agreed. "This is something else entirely. I've been searching my texts for days without finding a clear answer." "May I offer a resource?" Cassian asked. "My castle library contains records dating back generations, documentation of illnesses and remedies far more extensive than what a border village could maintain. If you're willing, I could have specific texts brought here, or—" He paused, and Illyra could see him weighing his next words carefully. "Or you could return to the capital with me, at least temporarily, and access those resources directly. I understand your reluctance to leave your people, but if this illness continues to spread, and if the answer lies in resources you don't currently have access to, it may be the fastest path to saving lives." Illyra considered his offer, torn between her instinct to remain with her patients and the practical reality that Cassian's suggestion made sense. She glanced at Oliver's pale, trembling form and made her decision quickly. "I'll go," she said, "but only for the resources, and only long enough to find an answer. My assistant Beatrice can manage basic care here while I'm gone, but I need to return as soon as possible." "Understood," Cassian said, relief evident in his expression. "We can leave within the hour, if you're prepared." While Illyra gathered supplies and gave Beatrice careful instructions for managing the patients, Ro found a moment to speak with her privately, his expression more serious than she'd seen it before. "He didn't need to come himself," Ro said quietly. "He could have sent riders to fetch you, or dispatched healers from the capital with resources. Instead, he rode 2 days on almost no sleep because he wanted to see this situation firsthand, and because, I suspect, he wanted to see you. Ro, I'm not trying to embarrass you," he said gently. "I'm trying to help you understand something important. In 12 years serving Cassian Draven, I have watched him make countless decisions, guided purely by strategy, by what benefits his kingdom most efficiently. This is not one of those decisions. This is personal, Illyra, and I think you already know that." Illyra didn't have a ready response, so she simply nodded and returned to her preparations, though Ro's words settled uncomfortably in her mind as she mounted her horse an hour later and prepared for the journey back to the capital. The ride passed mostly in comfortable silence, Cassian keeping pace beside her, while Ro and the guards trailed slightly behind. Occasionally he would point out landmarks along the route, sharing small pieces of history about the territories they passed through, and Illyra found herself relaxing into the rhythm of conversation, despite the worry still gnawing at her thoughts. "You're troubled," Cassian observed as they stopped to rest the horses near a small stream. "My patience," she admitted. "I've never seen symptoms quite like this before, and not knowing the cause makes it difficult to treat effectively." "We'll find the answer," he said, with such quiet confidence that she almost believed him completely. "My library has served my family for generations. If there's a documented case of this illness anywhere in our history, we'll find it." They reached the capital by nightfall, and Cassian wasted no time leading her directly to the castle's vast library, a room so filled with towering shelves and ancient texts that Illyra felt momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of it. He guided her toward a section dedicated to medical records, pulling volumes from the shelves with practiced familiarity. They worked together through the night, Cassian proving surprisingly knowledgeable about the library's organization, fetching texts she requested, and occasionally offering insights of his own that surprised her with their depth. Near midnight, exhausted and beginning to lose hope, Illyra finally found a passage in a text nearly a century old that described symptoms matching exactly what she had observed in Ashenford. "Here," she said, excitement cutting through her exhaustion as she read aloud. "A seasonal illness caused by contamination in well water during certain months, when specific minerals leach into the ground from nearby rock formations. The tremors, the sudden collapse, all of it matches." Cassian leaned over her shoulder to read the passage himself, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that her concentration wavered for a moment before she refocused on the text. "The treatment," she continued, "requires a specific combination of purifying herbs, administered over several days, along with treating the water source itself to prevent further contamination. Then we have our answer," Cassian said, and the relief in his voice matched her own. I'll have riders prepare to escort you back to Ashenford at first light with everything you need. Elira nodded, gratitude washing over her as the weight of worry finally began to lift. Thank you, Cassian. Truly. Without access to this library, I might not have found the answer in time. You would have found it eventually, he said. You're far too skilled to have failed your people, but I'm glad I could help hasten the process. They sat together in the quiet library for a moment longer, the exhaustion of the long day finally catching up with both of them. Elira found herself studying his profile in the soft candlelight, the sharp lines of his face softened by fatigue, and something gentler that she rarely saw him display in front of others. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Of course. Why did you really come to Ashenford yourself? You could have sent anyone, and the outcome would have been the same. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, he admitted finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Since you left the capital, I've found myself distracted in ways I don't understand. Meetings I should focus on, decisions that require my full attention, and instead, my mind keeps returning to a healer from a border village who refused everything I offered her, twice now, and somehow made me respect her more for it, rather than less. Elira's breath caught in her throat, the honesty of his admission catching her completely off guard. Cassian. I'm not asking you to stay again, he said quickly, before she could respond. I understand your reasons, and I respect them. I simply wanted you to know the truth, whatever you choose to do with it. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken possibilities, and Elira found herself uncertain how to respond, torn between the practical reality of her responsibilities and the undeniable pull she felt toward this man who had ridden 2 days without rest, simply to help her save strangers he'd never meet. I should sleep, she said finally, standing and gathering the texts they had found. The riders will need to leave early, and I want to be ready to treat my patients the moment I arrive. Cassian nodded, though she saw the flicker of disappointment cross his face once more, before he masked it, the same composed expression settling back into place. Of course, I'll have everything prepared for your departure. As she made her way to the guest chamber that had been prepared for her, Elira's mind raced with everything that had happened, everything Cassian had said, everything she felt but hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She thought of Ro's words from weeks ago, echoing in her memory with new weight. No one has ever refused him. She had refused him twice now, and both times he had responded not with anger or dismissal, but with a deepening respect, an increasing determination to understand her, to be near her, to offer not just resources but himself. It frightened her more than she wanted to admit, this growing certainty that whatever was building between them was far too significant to simply walk away from unchanged. But Ashenford needed her, and she refused to abandon her duties simply because a king's attention had turned toward her in ways she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely prepared to navigate. She fell asleep eventually, though her dreams remained restless, filled with dark eyes and quiet confessions and a growing awareness that her carefully ordered life was becoming far more complicated than she had ever intended. The riders departed at dawn as promised, carrying everything Elira needed to treat her patients and purify the contaminated well water back in Ashenford. Cassian saw her off personally, standing at the castle gates as she mounted her horse, his expression carefully composed once more, though something in his eyes told her the conversation from the previous night remained unfinished between them. Take care of your people, he said simply. I will, she replied. Thank you again for everything. She rode away from the capital with her mind still turning over everything that had happened, uncertain when their paths would cross again, but increasingly aware that some invisible thread now connected her to this man, in ways she hadn't chosen and couldn't easily sever. Whatever waited on the horizon, she suspected their story was far from finished. Oliver's fever broke on the 3rd day after the treatment arrived, and by the end of the week, all 4 patients in Ashenford had recovered fully. The well was treated according to the ancient text's instructions, and Elira felt a deep satisfaction watching her village return to its normal rhythm of life. Children playing near the water source they had once feared, mothers no longer glancing anxiously toward the horizon for signs of new illness. Life should have settled back into its familiar patterns after that, the crisis resolved and her duties fulfilled. Instead, Alira found herself distracted in ways she hadn't experienced before, her mind wandering unexpectedly to conversations held in a candlelit library, to the sound of a king's voice admitting things she suspected he rarely shared with anyone. She told herself it meant nothing, that gratitude and exhaustion had simply blurred the lines of what should have remained a professional relationship. But when a letter arrived nearly a month later, carried by a rider she now recognized from Cassian's personal guard, her heart betrayed her by leaping before she'd even broken the seal. The letter was brief, written in Cassian's own hand rather than dictated to a scribe, and it contained no urgent crisis, no plague or poisoning requiring her immediate attention. Instead, it simply asked how she and her village had fared since her departure, whether Oliver and the others had recovered fully, and whether she might consider visiting the capital again, not out of necessity, but simply because he wished to see her. Alira read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, her thoughts a tangled mess of practicality and something warmer she still refused to name outright. She had responsibilities in Ashenford. She had built a life here, a purpose, a place among people who needed her skills and trusted her judgment. A visit to the capital, one not driven by emergency, felt like something entirely different from the crises that had brought them together before. And yet, she found herself drafting a response before she'd fully decided to send it, explaining that her village was thriving, that Oliver had returned to his usual mischief within days of recovering, and that she might indeed be able to visit within the coming weeks, once she had arranged proper coverage for her patients. She sent the letter before she could talk herself out of it. 3 weeks later, she found herself once again riding toward the capital, this time without the weight of crisis pressing down on her shoulders, without patients waiting anxiously for a cure she hadn't yet found. This visit felt different in ways she couldn't quite articulate, lighter somehow, though the uncertainty of what waited for her at the end of the journey created its own particular kind of tension. Cassian met her at the gates again, and something in his expression when he saw her approaching told her he had been waiting there for some time, perhaps longer than protocol required. He helped her dismount with a formality that felt almost performative, as though he were carefully containing something beneath the surface. "You came," he said, echoing words he'd spoken during her first return to the capital. "You invited me," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips despite her efforts to remain composed. He showed her around the castle grounds, in ways he hadn't during her previous visits, when urgent business had always pulled their attention elsewhere. They walked through gardens she hadn't known existed, tucked behind the eastern wing, and filled with flowers that bloomed in careful arrangements that suggested someone tended them with genuine devotion. "My mother designed these gardens," Cassian explained as they walked among the blooms. "Before she passed, she spent countless hours here, teaching me the names of every flower, every herb, insisting that even a king should understand the value of things that grow slowly and require patience. She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," he said, and something wistful passed across his features. "I think you would have liked her. She had little patience for flattery or false pretense, much like someone else I've come to know recently." Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks and focused her attention on a cluster of deep purple flowers, rather than meeting his gaze directly. "Cassian, I want to be honest with you about something. Please. These feelings, whatever is developing between us, they frighten me a little," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. "I've spent my entire life building independence, learning to rely on my own skills and judgment rather than depending on anyone else. The thought of caring for someone in a way that might compromise that independence, especially someone with as much power and responsibility as you carry, it's not something I take lightly." Cassian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious and attentive in a way that told her he was truly listening, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "I would never want you to lose yourself in caring for me," he said carefully. "Alira, part of what draws me to you is precisely that independence, that refusal to simply accept whatever I offer without question. I don't want a version of you who exists only to please me or serve my interests. I want you exactly as you are, stubborn refusals and all." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with unspoken possibility. Finally, Alira allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "You have a strange way of courting someone," she said, "considering I've now turned down 2 formal offers from you." Perhaps I simply appreciate a challenge, Cassian replied, and the playfulness in his tone surprised her, a lightness she hadn't expected from a man usually so composed and controlled. Or perhaps I've simply never met anyone quite like you before, and I'm not willing to let that go easily. They continued their walk through the gardens as afternoon shifted toward evening, conversation flowing easily between them in ways that felt entirely different from their previous interactions, which had always been shadowed by crisis and urgency. Alira learned more about Cassian's childhood, about the pressures of inheriting his position at a young age after his father's unexpected passing, about the loneliness that often accompanied leadership when few people around him spoke to him honestly, rather than simply telling him what he wanted to hear. In turn, she shared stories of her own upbringing, of learning healing from her mother and grandmother, of the satisfaction she found in solving problems that others couldn't, of her deep loyalty to Ashenford and the people who had shaped her into who she was. By the time evening settled fully around them, they had made their way to a small stone balcony overlooking the castle grounds, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Cassian stood beside her, close but not touching, and Alira found herself acutely aware of every inch of space between them. "I have another proposal for you," he said quietly, and she felt her heart rate quicken at his words. "Cassian. Not the same as before," he clarified quickly. "I'm not asking you to abandon Ashenford or accept a permanent position in my court. I understand now that such offers were perhaps too much, too soon, framed in ways that felt like acquisition rather than genuine connection. Then what are you asking?" "Simply this," he said, turning to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Allow me to court you properly, in whatever way makes sense given the distance between our lives. Let me visit Ashenford when I can. Let me write to you regularly. Let us discover together whether what's growing between us is worth building into something lasting. No demands, no expectations beyond honesty and mutual respect." The proposal, so different from his previous offers, struck something deep within Alira's chest. This wasn't about resources or positions, or the trappings of royal life. This was simply a man asking for the chance to know her better, to build something slowly and genuinely, rather than expecting her to simply accept a role predetermined by his status. "I would like that," she said finally, surprising herself with how easily the words came once she allowed herself to speak them honestly. "But Cassian, I need you to understand something important. Whatever develops between us, I will never abandon my responsibilities to Ashenford. If you're seeking someone willing to become simply an extension of your court, someone who exists only within these castle walls, I'm not that person, and never will be." "I know," he said, and the certainty in his voice reassured her. "I wouldn't want you to be. Alira, part of what I admire most about you is your unwavering commitment to your people. The same commitment I try to hold toward my own kingdom, even when it's difficult, even when it requires sacrifice. I would never ask you to abandon that. I only ask for the chance to build something between us, despite the distance and complications that come with our different lives." Alira felt something settle within her chest, a quiet certainty she hadn't expected to find so easily. "Then yes," she said, "I would welcome that." Cassian's expression transformed with genuine joy, a rare and beautiful sight that made her chest tighten with warmth. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose, and gently took her hand in his fingers warm and careful against her skin. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance, despite every reason you might have had to walk away entirely." They stood together on the balcony, as darkness fully settled over the castle grounds, hands joined and hearts cautiously opening toward possibilities neither had fully anticipated when this strange journey began. Alira knew the road ahead would carry its own challenges, the distance between Ashenford and the capital, the pressures of Cassian's position, the expectations of a court that had never seen their king pursue anyone with such personal, uncomplicated intention. But standing there in the quiet evening air, her hand held gently in his, she felt a growing certainty that whatever challenges awaited them, they were worth facing together, one honest conversation at a time. The council chamber fell silent the moment Cassian mentioned Alira's name during what should have been a routine discussion about border security. Ro watched from his customary position near the king's right hand as the assembled advisors exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to poorly concealed disapproval. "You wish to divert resources toward improving the road between here and Ashenford," repeated an older advisor named Nathaniel, his tone carefully neutral, though his skepticism was evident. "For what purpose, if I may ask, given that Ashenford holds no particular strategic significance to the kingdom's broader interests?" "The healer who resides there has proven invaluable to this kingdom on multiple occasions," Cassian replied evenly. "Ensuring safer, faster travel between the capital and Ashenford serves everyone's interests, particularly if future emergencies require her assistance." Rowe noticed the way several advisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing the thin justification for what it truly was. Word had spread quickly through the court about the king's growing attachment to the border healer, and not everyone viewed the development favorably. After the council session concluded, Nathaniel lingered behind, approaching Rowe with obvious concern etched across his weathered features. "This healer," he said quietly, "she has become quite significant to our king, hasn't she?" "More than significant," Rowe admitted, seeing no benefit in pretending otherwise with someone as perceptive as Nathaniel. "I haven't seen him this invested in anything, or anyone, since before his father's passing." "That concerns me," Nathaniel said. "Not because I doubt her character. From what I've heard, she's proven herself capable and honorable. But our king carries responsibilities beyond his personal desires. The kingdom expects him to eventually secure alliances through appropriate matches, connections that strengthen our position among neighboring territories. A border healer, however skilled, offers none of those strategic advantages." Rowe understood the concern, even shared some of it himself, though watching Cassian's genuine happiness over these past weeks made him reluctant to voice such reservations too strongly. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "our king deserves the chance to find happiness beyond pure strategy, particularly given how much of his life has already been dedicated entirely to duty." "Happiness is a luxury kings rarely enjoy," Nathaniel replied, though his tone carried more resignation than harshness. "I only hope he understands what he risks by pursuing this connection so openly, particularly if the council begins actively opposing it." The warning settled uncomfortably in Rowe's thoughts as he made his way toward Cassian's private study later that evening, finding the king seated at his desk, though his attention seemed focused on a letter rather than the reports scattered before him. "Writing to her again?" Rowe asked, settling into a chair across from the desk without waiting for formal invitation, a privilege earned through over a decade of loyal service. "Is it that obvious?" Cassian asked, though he didn't seem particularly troubled by the observation. "You've been smiling at parchment for the better part of an hour," Rowe said dryly. "Yes, it's rather obvious." Cassian set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying his beta, with an expression that suggested he sensed something beyond simple teasing in Rowe's tone. "You have concerns," he said. It wasn't a question. "The council is growing uneasy," Rowe admitted honestly. "Nathaniel approached me after today's session, worried that your attention toward Alira might complicate expectations regarding strategic alliances the kingdom may need in coming years." Cassian's expression hardened slightly, though he kept his voice controlled. "I'm well aware of what the council expects from me regarding potential alliances. I've spent my entire adult life balancing personal desire against duty, and I don't need reminders about the complications my choices might create." "I'm not trying to lecture you," Rowe said quickly. "I simply want you to be prepared, should opposition grow stronger than mild concern. Some among the council may view Alira as a genuine threat to political stability, particularly if your feelings for her continue deepening as they clearly have." "Let them worry," Cassian said, though the tension in his shoulders suggested the concern affected him more than he wanted to admit. "I've followed duty's demands for every significant decision in my reign. This, at least, I intend to pursue, based on what my own heart tells me, regardless of council opinion." Rowe studied his king for a long moment, recognizing the stubborn determination that had served Cassian well in matters of governance, but might prove more complicated when applied to matters of the heart, particularly heart matters entangled with political expectation. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I believe you deserve the chance to pursue this, whatever complications arise. I've watched you carry the weight of this kingdom for years, without complaint, without allowing yourself any personal indulgence beyond duty. If Alira Voss makes you genuinely happy, I won't be the one standing in your way. Something eased in Cassian's expression at his beta's words, gratitude evident despite his usual reluctance to display vulnerability openly. Thank you, Ro. Your support means more than you realize. Just be prepared, Ro said, standing to leave. Not everyone in this court will share my perspective, and some may act on their concerns in ways that create genuine difficulty for both you and Alira. The warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them anticipated. Within days, whispers began circulating through the castle, regarding the king's unusual attachment to a common healer from an insignificant border village, rumors that grew increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. Some claimed Alira had used healing magic to enchant the king's judgment. Others suggested she sought only wealth and status, using her medical skills as a manipulative tool to secure a position far beyond what her humble origins warranted. Cassian did his best to shield himself from the worst of the gossip, though the persistent undercurrent of court disapproval began weighing on him more than he initially expected. He found himself increasingly protective of his correspondence with Alira, careful about when and how he discussed her, aware that seemingly innocent comments could quickly transform into fuel for further speculation. The situation reached a breaking point during a formal dinner held to honor visiting dignitaries from a neighboring territory, an occasion that required Cassian's full political attention despite his growing distraction. Seated beside him throughout the elaborate meal was Lady Eleanor, daughter of a prominent noble family whose territory bordered Blackthorn's eastern edge, a woman the council had quietly suggested might make an appropriate strategic match given her family's considerable influence. Lady Eleanor proved charming and politically astute throughout the dinner, engaging Cassian in thoughtful conversation about trade agreements and territorial cooperation, clearly aware of the implicit expectations surrounding her presence at the king's side. Ro watched from across the hall, noting the careful way various nobles observed the interaction, gauging whether their king might finally be persuaded toward a more strategically beneficial connection. "You seem distracted this evening, Your Majesty," Lady Eleanor observed at one point, her tone gentle but perceptive. "If you'll forgive my directness, court gossip suggests your attention has been captured elsewhere recently." Cassian's expression remained carefully composed, though Ro, watching closely, noticed the slight tension in his jaw. "Court gossip often exaggerates matters beyond their true significance," Cassian replied diplomatically. "Perhaps," Lady Eleanor said, though her knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Though I've found that gossip, however exaggerated, rarely emerges from complete fabrication. There's usually some truth at its foundation, however distorted the details might become in the retelling." The conversation continued along careful diplomatic lines for the remainder of the evening, but Ro noticed Cassian's relief when the dinner finally concluded, and he could excuse himself from further scrutiny. Later that night, as Ro helped review reports before retiring, Cassian finally voiced the frustration he'd carefully contained throughout the evening. "They speak of Alira as though she's some calculated threat to be managed," he said, his voice carrying an edge of anger Ro rarely witnessed. "As though her only value lies in political utility, and anything beyond that framework represents dangerous foolishness on my part. The court has always struggled to understand desires that exist outside strategic calculation," Ro said gently. "It doesn't make their concerns less genuine, even if their methods of expressing those concerns prove frustrating." Cassian sighed heavily, running a hand through his dark hair in evident exhaustion. "I know their concerns aren't entirely unfounded. Alliances matter, strategic positioning matters. But Ro, when I'm with Alira, when I read her letters or remember our conversations, I feel something I haven't experienced since before my father's passing. A sense of genuine connection, unburdened by calculation or expectation. I'm not willing to sacrifice that simply because it doesn't align neatly with political convenience." "Then don't," Ro said simply, "but understand that maintaining this connection may require you to defend it more actively than you have thus far. The whispers won't fade on their own, and Lady Eleanor's family carries enough influence that quiet dismissal may not be sufficient to address their expectations." Cassian nodded slowly, the weight of the challenge ahead settling visibly across his shoulders. "Then I'll defend it," he said, determination hardening his voice. "Alira deserves better than to become the subject of court gossip and political maneuvering simply because she chose to help this kingdom when it needed her most." As Ro left the study that night, he found himself hoping, more than he'd expected to, that his king's determination would prove sufficient to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. 12 years of service had taught him to recognize genuine conviction, and whatever else remained uncertain about this unusual courtship, Cassian's feelings for Alira Voss were undeniably real, deeper than simple infatuation or fleeting attraction. Whether that genuine connection would prove strong enough to withstand the mounting political pressure remained an open question, one that Rose suspected would be tested far sooner than either he or his king anticipated. News of the growing court controversy reached Alira through an unexpected source, a merchant named Simon who traveled regularly between the capital and Ashenford, carrying goods and, apparently, gossip along with his usual cargo. He mentioned it casually, while delivering supplies to her small clinic, clearly unaware of the personal significance his words carried. "They say the king has taken quite an interest in some healer," Simon remarked while unloading crates of medicinal herbs. "Court's all abuzz about it, apparently. Some folks think it's romantic, others think it's a scandal waiting to happen, what with all the political marriage talk that usually surrounds royalty." Alira kept her expression neutral, though her stomach twisted uncomfortably at the casual way Simon discussed what she now understood to be her own situation, transformed into court entertainment by people who had never met her and knew nothing of the genuine connection developing between herself and Cassian. "Do they say who this healer is?" she asked carefully, unable to resist the question, despite already suspecting the answer. "Someone from a border village, I believe," Simon said, oblivious to her rising tension. "Word is she's turned down his offers multiple times, which apparently only made him more interested. Strange business, if you ask me. Most folks would jump at the chance for royal favor." After Simon departed, Alira sat alone in her clinic, processing this new information with growing unease. She had known, in an abstract sense, that her relationship with Cassian carried political implications given his position. But hearing it discussed so casually, by a merchant who had no personal stake in the matter, made the reality feel suddenly more concrete, more threatening to the careful balance she and Cassian had been building through their letters and occasional visits. She wrote to him that evening, her words more direct than usual as she addressed the rumors circulating through the capital. His response arrived a week later, longer than his typical letters, filled with careful reassurance mixed with honest acknowledgement of the challenges they faced. He wrote of the council's concerns, of Lady Eleanor and the pressure to consider more strategically advantageous connections, of his own determination to continue pursuing what existed between them regardless of political inconvenience. His words carried genuine conviction, but Alira found herself troubled nonetheless, uncertain whether his confidence adequately accounted for the real complications ahead. Her uncertainty deepened further when, nearly 2 weeks later, an unexpected visitor arrived at her clinic. A woman she didn't recognize, dressed in fine traveling clothes that marked her as someone of considerable status, requested a private conversation, introducing herself as Lady Margaret, a distant cousin of Lady Eleanor, who claimed to be traveling through the region and had heard of the famous border healer. "I confess my visit isn't entirely coincidental," Lady Margaret admitted, once they were settled in Alira's small sitting room, away from curious ears. "I wanted to meet the woman who has captured our king's attention so thoroughly." Alira remained cautious, sensing something calculated beneath the woman's pleasant demeanor. "I'm not certain what you hope to accomplish through this visit, Lady Margaret." "Simply understanding," Lady Margaret said, her tone carefully gentle, though her eyes remained sharp with assessment. "You must understand, Alira, that the court has certain expectations regarding whom their king eventually chooses to align himself with. Political marriages serve important purposes, securing alliances, strengthening territories, ensuring stability for generations to come. A connection formed purely from personal affection, however genuine, cannot provide those same strategic benefits." "I've never claimed to offer strategic benefits," Alira replied, keeping her voice steady despite the growing tension she felt. "Whatever exists between myself and Cassian developed from genuine connection, not political calculation." "Precisely my concern," Lady Margaret said. "Genuine connection is admirable in private life, but kings rarely enjoy the luxury of purely private lives. Every choice he makes carries consequences beyond simple personal happiness. Have you truly considered what it would mean, practically speaking, to become entangled with someone of his position? The scrutiny, the constant political pressure, The resentment from families like my own who believe more strategically appropriate matches would better serve the kingdom's interests. Alira felt the weight of the woman's words settling heavily in her chest, articulating fears she had already begun considering privately, but hadn't fully confronted. I haven't made any decisions about the future, she said carefully. Cassian and I are simply exploring what exists between us, without demands or expectations beyond honesty. How admirably cautious, Lady Margaret said, though something in her tone suggested she found the approach naive rather than wise. I only hope, for both your sakes, that this exploration reaches its natural conclusion before feelings deepen beyond the point of practical reconsideration. Kingdoms have fallen before, due to poorly considered romantic entanglements, however genuine the initial affection might have been. After Lady Margaret departed, Alira sat alone with her troubled thoughts for hours, the visit having stirred anxieties she'd been carefully avoiding since the political gossip first reached her ears. She trusted Cassian's genuine feelings, trusted the connection they had built through honest conversation and shared vulnerability. But Lady Margaret's warnings, however self-serving their motivation might have been, weren't entirely without merit. Was she being naive, believing that genuine affection could withstand the mounting political pressure surrounding their connection? Was she risking not only her own emotional well-being, but potentially destabilizing a kingdom that depended on Cassian's careful leadership, simply by allowing this relationship to continue developing? She didn't write to Cassian immediately, needing time to process these uncomfortable questions before she could articulate them clearly. Instead, she threw herself into her work, treating patients throughout Ashenford with focused determination, trying to lose herself in familiar routine while her thoughts continued churning beneath the surface. It was nearly 3 weeks before she finally composed a letter addressing her concerns honestly, describing Lady Margaret's visit and the questions it had raised in her mind. She didn't accuse Cassian of anything, didn't suggest ending their connection, but she made clear that the political pressures surrounding them had begun weighing on her more heavily than she initially expected, and that she needed reassurance that this path forward, however uncertain, was truly worth the complications it created. Cassian's response arrived faster than usual, carried by a rider who had clearly traveled with unusual urgency. His letter was shorter than his typical correspondence, but the intensity of his words left no room for doubt regarding his feelings. He wrote that Lady Margaret's visit had been unauthorized, an overstepping he intended to address directly with her family. He acknowledged the genuine difficulties ahead, the political complications that would likely intensify rather than fade, but he reaffirmed his determination to pursue their connection regardless of those obstacles. He wrote of choosing his own path forward, of refusing to sacrifice genuine happiness simply because it proved inconvenient for others' strategic calculations. But beyond the reassurance, he included something else entirely unexpected. He announced his intention to visit Ashenford again within the month, not for any crisis or emergency, but simply to spend time with her directly, away from the pressures and gossip of the capital, to have the honest conversation their situation clearly demanded. Alira read his letter multiple times, feeling some of her anxiety ease even as new uncertainty took its place. She wanted to believe his conviction, wanted to trust that whatever grew between them could withstand the political storms threatening to complicate their connection. But she also recognized that words on parchment, however sincere, couldn't fully address the practical challenges ahead. Whatever answers they needed would have to come through direct, honest conversation, face to face, without the buffer of distance and letters to soften difficult truths. She found herself both anticipating and dreading his upcoming visit, aware that the conversation ahead might well determine whether their connection could survive the mounting pressures surrounding it, or whether Lady Margaret's warnings about impossible complications would ultimately prove prophetic. As the days counted down toward his arrival, Alira continued her work in Ashenford, treating patients and managing her responsibilities with practiced competence, even as her thoughts increasingly turned toward the uncertain future awaiting her, and the king who had somehow, despite every obstacle and complication, become undeniably significant to her heart. The smoke reached Ashenford before the messenger did, a thin gray line rising from the direction of the capital that made Alira's stomach drop the moment she noticed it while tending her garden. Within the hour, an exhausted rider arrived with news that confirmed her worst fears had barely begun to scratch the surface of what was actually happening. "The illness has returned," the rider gasped, nearly falling from his horse in his exhaustion. Worse than before. Dozens of cases in just the past 3 days. The king's own brother has fallen ill, and the physicians fear he won't survive the week. Elira didn't hesitate, gathering her supplies with practiced efficiency, even as dread coiled tight in her chest. Cassian didn't have a brother that she knew of, and confusion mixed with her urgency until the rider clarified, his voice hoarse with fatigue. His cousin, Lord Henry, raised alongside him like a brother since childhood. The king hasn't left his bedside in 2 days. She rode for the capital within the hour, pushing her horse harder than she probably should have, arriving as dusk settled heavily over the castle grounds. The atmosphere inside the walls felt different from her previous visits, thick with fear and desperation that seemed to permeate every corridor she passed through on her way to the infirmary. What she found there exceeded even her worst expectations. The infirmary, once quiet and orderly, now overflowed with patients. Cots lined up in every available space, physicians moving between them with exhausted, hollow expressions that suggested they had long since exceeded their capacity to help everyone who needed treatment. Cassian sat beside a cot near the far wall, his usually composed appearance completely abandoned. His hair was disheveled, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders carried a weight that seemed far heavier than mere physical exhaustion could explain. The man lying on the cot beside him, presumably Lord Henry, showed symptoms far more severe than anything Elira had encountered before. His skin an unhealthy gray pallor, black veins spreading not just along his arms but across his neck and face. Elira. Cassian's voice cracked slightly as he noticed her approach, relief and desperation warring visibly across his features. Thank the ancestors you came. How long has he been like this? Elira asked, already kneeling beside Lord Henry and beginning her examination, professional focus taking over despite the chaos surrounding her. 3 days, Cassian said. It started the same as before, but this time, it's spreading faster, hitting harder. We haven't identified the source, and my physicians are running out of options. Elira worked quickly, checking Lord Henry's pulse, his breathing, the extent of the poisoning that had clearly progressed beyond anything she'd previously treated. The severity concerned her deeply, but she forced herself to focus on the practical steps necessary to help him, rather than allowing panic to cloud her judgment. This is different from the shadow root poisoning, she said, working as she spoke. The progression is too rapid, the symptoms too severe. Whoever is behind this has refined their methods significantly since Victor's capture. Can you save him? Cassian asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the desperate hope in his question nearly breaking her heart. I'll do everything possible, she said honestly, unwilling to offer false certainty in a situation this severe. But Cassian, I need you to trust my judgment completely right now, and I need space to work without distraction. He nodded immediately, stepping back to give her room, while remaining close enough to assist if needed. For the next several hours, Elira poured every ounce of her skill and knowledge into treating Lord Henry, drawing on techniques she'd developed through the previous crisis, while adapting to address the increased severity of this new outbreak. Around midnight, as she finally began to see small signs of improvement in Lord Henry's condition, one of the younger physicians approached with urgent news that pulled her attention away momentarily. 7 more patients had arrived within the past hour alone, the outbreak spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, overwhelming their already strained resources. Elira made a rapid decision, delegating care of Lord Henry to another skilled healer, once his condition stabilized enough to allow it, then moving through the infirmary to assess the broader crisis unfolding around them. What she discovered painted an increasingly grim picture. This wasn't simply a more severe version of the previous poisoning. Based on the pattern of symptoms and the speed of transmission between patients who had shared close quarters, this appeared to be something contagious, spreading through direct contact rather than through contaminated food or water, as the previous outbreak had. We need to isolate the infected patients immediately, she announced, taking charge with an authority that none of the exhausted physicians questioned. Separate wards, minimal contact between healers treating different patients, and everyone handling infected individuals needs to change garments and wash thoroughly between patients. The physician scrambled to implement her instructions, and Cassian, despite his exhaustion and worry for his cousin, threw himself into organizing the practical logistics required to manage such a significant reorganization of the infirmary's resources. Watching him work, coordinating supplies and personnel even while his own emotional state remained clearly fragile, deepened Alira's respect for him, in ways that transcended the romantic feelings already building between them. By dawn, they had established a workable system, though the crisis remained far from resolved. Nearly 30 patients now filled the reorganized infirmary, and reports continued arriving of new cases emerging throughout the capital, suggesting the contagion had already spread beyond what quick isolation could fully contain. Alira found Cassian alone briefly, during a rare quiet moment, standing at a window overlooking the courtyard, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft colors that felt almost mockingly peaceful given the chaos unfolding within the castle walls. "You should rest," she said gently, approaching his side. "You've been awake for days, and you won't be able to help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I can't rest," he said, his voice hollow with fatigue and worry. "Henry might not survive this, Alira. He's the closest thing I have to a brother, and I feel completely helpless watching him suffer while this illness spreads faster than we can contain it." Alira reached out, taking his hand in hers without hesitation, offering what comfort she could through simple physical connection. "You're not helpless," she said firmly. "You've organized resources, coordinated response efforts, and given your people hope simply by remaining present and engaged, despite your own fear. That matters, Cassian, even if it doesn't feel like enough right now." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that spoke of emotions too overwhelming to fully articulate. "I keep thinking about what Lady Margaret said to you," he admitted quietly, "about whether pursuing this connection between us was worth the complications it might create. Watching everything falling apart around us right now, I understand more clearly why some might view personal happiness as a luxury kings can't afford." Alira felt her chest tighten at his words, uncertainty creeping back in despite her determination to remain strong for him. "Do you regret this?" she asked, unable to fully mask the vulnerability in her voice. "Us, I mean?" "Never," he said immediately, gripping her hand more firmly. "Alira, having you here right now, watching you work with such skill and determination to save my people, despite the danger and exhaustion, it only confirms everything I already believed about you. I don't regret pursuing this connection. I only fear that circumstances beyond our control might make it impossible to sustain, regardless of how deeply I've come to care for you." The honesty of his admission, raw and unguarded in ways that felt different from their previous careful conversations, settled something within Alira's chest, even as new worries emerged. Whatever challenges lay ahead, political pressure or contagious illness, or the countless complications that came with loving someone carrying such significant responsibility, she recognized in that moment that walking away simply wasn't something she could bring herself to consider. "We'll figure this out together," she said firmly. "The illness, the political pressure, whatever comes next. I'm not going anywhere, Cassian, not while you need me, and not while I care about you as deeply as I do." Something shifted in his expression, hope breaking through the exhaustion and fear that had dominated his features throughout the long night. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a small gesture that carried enormous weight given everything unfolding around them. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, for fighting for my people, and for choosing to fight for this connection between us, despite every reason you might have had to walk away." Their quiet moment couldn't last, interrupted quickly by another physician, calling for Alira's assistance with a newly arrived patient, showing severe symptoms. She squeezed Cassian's hand once more, before hurrying back toward the infirmary, her mind already refocusing on the medical crisis demanding her attention. But even as she threw herself back into treating patients, working through exhaustion that mirrored Cassian's own, something had shifted within her during that brief exchange by the window. Whatever uncertainty had lingered since Lady Margaret's visit, whatever doubts Lord Henry's dangerous illness had temporarily reinforced, she now understood with complete clarity that she was fully committed to this path forward, regardless of the obstacles still waiting to be overcome. The crisis would demand everything from her over the coming days, testing her skills and endurance in ways that would push her beyond anything she'd previously experienced. But she faced it now, with renewed determination, knowing that whatever she managed to accomplish, she wasn't facing these challenges alone anymore. She had Cassian beside her, and together, she believed, they could weather whatever storms continued gathering around them. By the fourth day of the outbreak, Illyra had barely slept, catching only brief moments of rest between treating an ever-growing number of patients. The illness had spread to nearly 50 individuals across the capital, and though her isolation protocols had slowed transmission somewhat, new cases continued emerging faster than she felt comfortable with. Lord Henry's condition had stabilized, though he remained weak, his recovery slower than the previous poisoning victims she had treated. Cassian split his time between overseeing the kingdom's response to the crisis and sitting with his cousin whenever duty allowed, though Illyra noticed him growing increasingly gaunt with worry and exhaustion, pushing himself as hard as she was pushing herself. It was during a rare quiet moment, while she reviewed her notes trying to identify a pattern in how the illness spread, that Ro found her in a small alcove off the main infirmary, his expression unusually serious, even for someone who typically carried himself with careful composure. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked. Illyra nodded, setting aside her notes and giving him her full attention despite her exhaustion. "Of course, Ro. Is something wrong?" "I want to tell you something," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Something I probably should have told you sooner, given everything unfolding around you and Cassian." She waited, curious despite her fatigue, sensing this conversation carried significant weight beyond simple casual discussion. "I've served Cassian Draven since he was barely more than a boy, thrust into leadership far too young after his father's sudden passing," Ro began. "I watched him grow into his role, watched him carry burdens that would have broken lesser men, watched him build walls around himself that kept everyone, myself included, at a careful distance. He learned early that vulnerability was dangerous for a king, that showing weakness invited exploitation from those seeking to challenge his authority." Illyra listened carefully, understanding that Ro was offering her something valuable, insight into the man she had come to care for so deeply. "For years, I watched him navigate relationships, whether political alliances or personal connections, always with the same careful distance," Ro continued. "He never allowed anyone close enough to truly know him, truly understand the person beneath the crown. Until you arrived, refusing his offers not once but multiple times, treating him as simply a man rather than an untouchable authority figure to be obeyed or manipulated." "I never intended to challenge him deliberately," Illyra said. "I simply spoke honestly, based on my own priorities and values." "That's precisely what made the difference," Ro said. "Cassian has spent his entire reign surrounded by people telling him what they think he wants to hear, seeking his favor through flattery and strategic positioning. You offered him something entirely different, genuine honesty without calculation, and I believe that's exactly what he needed, whether he consciously recognized it or not." Illyra felt her throat tighten with emotion, moved by Ro's obvious care for his king, and his willingness to share such personal observations with her. "Why are you telling me this now, in the middle of everything happening?" "Because I think you need to understand the full significance of what you mean to him, particularly given the challenges ahead," Ro said seriously. "The political pressure surrounding your connection isn't going to fade easily, and this current crisis only adds another layer of complication to an already difficult situation. I want you to understand that whatever obstacles emerge, Cassian's feelings for you aren't simply infatuation or temporary distraction. You represent something he's never had before, someone who sees him clearly and chooses to stay regardless of what that clarity reveals." "I care for him deeply too," Illyra said quietly. "More than I expected to when this all began." "I know," Ro said, offering her a small, genuine smile. "It's obvious in the way you look at him, in the exhaustion you're pushing through right now to save his people during this crisis. I simply wanted you to understand the full weight of what you're building together, particularly as challenges continue mounting around you both." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from another physician, news that 3 additional patients had arrived, showing symptoms far more severe than anything they'd encountered thus far. Illyra rushed to assist, Ro's words settling into her thoughts even as she threw herself back into the demanding work of treating the outbreak. Over the following 2 days, the crisis reached its most critical point. The number of infected individuals climbed past 60, and despite Illyra's best efforts, 3 patients succumbed to the illness despite everyone's attempts to save them. Each loss weighed heavily on her, though she forced herself to remain focused, understanding that dwelling too deeply on failures would only compromise her ability to help the patients still fighting for survival. Cassian remained a constant presence throughout, coordinating resources, comforting grieving families, and somehow finding the strength to continue supporting his people, despite his own mounting exhaustion and fear. Watching him during those darkest hours, Elira found her admiration for him deepening even further, recognizing the genuine strength of character that lay beneath his royal title. It was during the height of this crisis, working alongside him to treat a particularly difficult case, that they finally identified the source of the renewed outbreak. A servant named Clara, working in the castle's water distribution system, had been compromised by promises of wealth from agents representing the same rival territory, responsible for the earlier Shadowroot poisoning. This time, they had developed a contagious variant, deliberately introduced through the capital's shared water sources, to maximize damage and destabilize Cassian's kingdom. When Clara was finally identified and confronted, she broke down immediately, revealing details of the conspiracy, while expressing genuine remorse for the suffering she had caused. Cassian, despite his justified anger, showed remarkable restraint, ensuring she received fair treatment, while focusing primarily on immediately addressing the compromised water sources to prevent further spread of the illness. With the source finally identified and neutralized, Elira and the other physicians could finally focus entirely on treatment rather than containment, and within another 3 days, they began seeing significant improvement across nearly all remaining patients. Lord Henry recovered enough to sit up in bed and hold conversation, his color returning gradually as the poison finally cleared from his system. The crisis, while devastating in its impact, finally began drawing to a close nearly 2 weeks after it started. Elira found herself collapsing from exhaustion the moment the immediate danger passed, her body finally giving way to the physical toll of days spent working without adequate rest. Cassian personally carried her to a private chamber, refusing to leave her side as she slept for nearly 18 hours straight, finally allowing her body the recovery it desperately needed. When she woke, disoriented but significantly restored, she found him sitting beside her bed, his own exhaustion evident, but his expression filled with such tender relief that her heart ached at the sight of him. "You're awake," he said softly, reaching for her hand immediately. "I was beginning to worry." "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice hoarse from days of continuous speaking and directing treatment efforts. "Nearly a full day," he said. "You collapsed from exhaustion after the crisis finally began resolving. Elira, you saved countless lives during these past 2 weeks, pushing yourself far beyond what anyone should reasonably be expected to endure. How is Lord Henry?" "Recovering well," Cassian said, relief evident in his voice. "The physicians expect him to make a full recovery within another week or 2. He asked me to convey his deepest gratitude once he learned the full extent of what you did to save him." Elira felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion in equal measure. "I'm just grateful the crisis is finally over." "It is," Cassian confirmed, gently squeezing her hand. "Thanks to you, and to your remarkable skill and dedication throughout this entire ordeal." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, before pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead, a tender gesture that carried enormous weight, given everything they had endured together throughout the crisis. "I don't know how to properly thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you've sacrificed to protect my people, my cousin, this entire kingdom. Whatever doubts I might have carried about our future together, watching you these past 2 weeks has erased every last one of them." Elira reached up, gently touching his exhausted face, feeling the weight of everything they had endured settling into something deeper and more permanent between them. "We face this together," she said softly. "And I believe we can face whatever comes next together as well, regardless of what political complications continue emerging around us." As they sat together in the quiet aftermath of the crisis, hands joined and hearts fully open to whatever challenges still awaited them, Elira felt a profound certainty settling within her chest. Whatever came next, whatever obstacles the court or circumstances continued placing in their path, she knew with complete conviction that she wanted to face those challenges, standing beside this man who had proven, time and again, the genuine depth of his character and his commitment to both his people and to her. 3 months passed following the crisis, and life in the capital gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. though the memory of those difficult weeks lingered in the collective consciousness of everyone who had lived through them. Elira divided her time between Ashenford and the capital, an arrangement that proved increasingly difficult to sustain, given her growing responsibilities in both locations, but one that neither she nor Cassian was willing to abandon, despite the practical challenges it created. The political pressure surrounding their connection hadn't disappeared, but the crisis had shifted certain dynamics within the court. Elira's tireless dedication throughout the outbreak, her willingness to sacrifice her own well-being to save countless lives, including the king's beloved cousin, had earned her genuine respect from many who had previously viewed her with skepticism or outright hostility. Nathaniel, the advisor who had first voiced concerns to Ro about the political complications of Cassian's attachment to Elira, approached her directly one afternoon while she worked in the castle's herb garden, tending to plants she had begun cultivating specifically for medicinal purposes. "Healer Voss," he said, his tone considerably warmer than during their previous limited interactions. "I wanted to personally thank you for everything you accomplished during the outbreak. My own granddaughter was among those you treated successfully." "I'm grateful I could help," Elira replied, genuinely touched by his gesture. "How is she recovering?" "Fully healed, thanks to your skill and dedication," Nathaniel said. "I confess, I held certain reservations about your relationship with our king, concerns rooted in traditional expectations about strategic alliances and appropriate matches. But watching your actions these past months has convinced me that character and genuine commitment matter far more than strategic calculation when determining who truly deserves a place of significance in this kingdom." His words meant more to Elira than she expected, representing a meaningful shift in how the court perceived her presence in Cassian's life. Though not everyone had fully embraced their connection, the tide of opinion was gradually turning in their favor, driven largely by the undeniable evidence of her genuine dedication to protecting the kingdom's people, regardless of personal cost. Lady Margaret, whose earlier warning visit had shaken Elira's confidence significantly, sent a brief letter shortly after the crisis concluded, acknowledging with surprising grace that her previous concerns, while perhaps well-intentioned from a strategic perspective, hadn't accounted for the genuine value someone with Elira's character and dedication could bring to the kingdom regardless of her humble origins. Lady Eleanor, the noble whom the council had hoped might secure a strategic marriage alliance with Cassian, proved equally gracious once the immediate political tension surrounding the succession question settled somewhat. During a chance encounter at a formal gathering, she approached Elira directly, her expression thoughtful rather than resentful. "I want you to know," Lady Eleanor said, "that I never truly expected, or particularly desired, the marriage alliance certain council members hope to arrange. Watching you these past months, your dedication and genuine care for the kingdom's people, I believe our king has chosen wisely, regardless of what strategic advantages a different match might have theoretically provided." These gradual shifts in court perception offered Elira genuine relief, though she remained acutely aware that not everyone had fully embraced their connection, and that maintaining this delicate balance would require continued effort and patience moving forward. It was during this period of cautious optimism that Cassian requested a private meeting with Elira in his study, his message carrying an unusual formality that immediately caught her attention when she received it. She arrived to find him standing near the window, his posture tense in a way that suggested significant weight behind whatever conversation he intended to initiate. "You wanted to speak with me?" she asked, settling into a chair across from his desk. "Yes," he said, turning to face her fully. "Elira, these past months have shown me something I need to address directly, rather than continuing to dance around through careful letters and occasional visits. I love you. Completely, without reservation, in ways that have only deepened through everything we've faced together." Her breath caught at his direct declaration, though she'd suspected the depth of his feelings for some time, based on his actions, and the tenderness he consistently displayed toward her. "I love you too," she said softly, the words feeling natural, despite the significance of speaking them aloud for the first time. "More than I ever expected to feel for anyone, particularly given how our connection began." Cassian's expression transformed with genuine relief and joy, though something more serious remained visible beneath the surface. "I want to build a life together," he continued, "not simply this arrangement of occasional visits and letters exchanged across distance, but something more permanent, more complete. But Alira, I understand the significant challenges this would require, particularly regarding Ashenford and your responsibilities there. What are you proposing exactly? She asked, though something in his tone suggested this conversation carried weight beyond a simple continuation of their current arrangement. I've been developing an idea, Cassian said, moving to sit in the chair beside her rather than remaining behind his desk, a small gesture that emphasized the personal nature of what he wanted to discuss. What if Ashenford didn't require you to choose between your responsibilities there and building a life with me here? What if we established a formal healing center, connected to both Ashenford and the capital, with resources to train additional healers who could eventually take on some of your current responsibilities in the village, while you maintain oversight and continue serving both communities? The proposal surprised her, revealing a level of thoughtful consideration for her priorities and independence that touched her deeply. You've been thinking about this seriously, she said, more statement than question. I've thought of little else, Cassian admitted. I understand that asking you to simply abandon Ashenford entirely was never a realistic or fair request, and I don't want to make that mistake again by pressuring you toward a decision that would compromise the values and commitments that make you who you are. This solution, if it works, would allow both of us to build a shared future without either of us sacrificing what matters most to our individual purposes. Alira felt overwhelming gratitude and love swelling within her chest, recognizing the genuine effort he had invested in finding a solution that honored both their connection and her independence. I think, she said carefully, that this could work beautifully. Training additional healers has always been something I wanted to pursue eventually, and having proper resources to establish a more formal training program would benefit not just Ashenford, but potentially the entire kingdom. Then you'll consider it? Cassian asked, hope evident in his voice. I'll do more than consider it, she said, smiling genuinely. I'll help you plan every detail, if you're truly serious about creating something this significant together. Their conversation continued late into the evening, discussing practical details of how such a healing center might function, where it might be located to serve both communities effectively, and how they might begin recruiting additional healers interested in training under Alira's guidance. The vision they built together that night represented something far more substantial than simple romantic connection, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving the people who depended on them both. As the conversation wound down and evening deepened into night, Cassian reached for her hand across the small distance separating their chairs, his expression growing more serious once more. There's something else I want to discuss, he said quietly. Something I've been considering for some time now, though I want to be certain you're ready to hear it before I say anything further. Alira's heart quickened, sensing the significance building in his tone. What is it? Marriage, he said simply, watching her reaction carefully. Alira, I want to marry you, not immediately, not before we've properly established the healing center and given ourselves time to build the practical foundation for our shared future, but eventually, when the timing feels right for both of us, I want you, as my wife, my equal partner in leading this kingdom forward. The word hung in the air between them, carrying weight and possibility that felt both overwhelming and completely natural, given everything they had built together over these past months. Alira felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by love and gratitude, and a deep sense of rightness about the future unfolding before them. Yes, she said softly, though she understood he hadn't yet formally proposed, understanding intuitively that he was testing the waters before taking that more definitive step. When the timing feels right, I would want that too. Cassian's expression transformed with pure joy, and he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles that carried the weight of promises yet to be formally spoken, but already deeply understood between them both. Then we'll build this future together, he said, one careful step at a time, ensuring everything we create honors both our individual purposes and the genuine partnership we've discovered together. As Alira finally made her way back to her guest chamber that night, her mind buzzing with excitement and possibility, she reflected on how far their connection had traveled since that first crisis in the infirmary, when Ro had whispered his warning about a king who had never faced refusal. She had refused Cassian 3 times, each refusal born not from rejection, but from her own steadfast commitment to values and responsibilities that mattered deeply to her. And rather than driving him away, those refusals had ultimately led them here, to a partnership built on genuine respect and mutual understanding, a foundation far stronger than anything that might have developed had she simply accepted his initial offers without question. Whatever challenges still awaited them in building this shared future, she faced them now with complete confidence, knowing that the love they had built together could withstand whatever obstacles remained ahead. A full year had passed since Alira first walked into the capital's infirmary and fought to save a dying soldier's life, and the changes that year had brought seemed almost impossible to fully comprehend when she paused occasionally to reflect on the journey that had led her to this moment. The healing center, established at the halfway point between Ashenford and the capital, now stood as a thriving institution, training a growing number of skilled healers who could serve communities throughout the kingdom's most vulnerable border territories. Beatrice, her former assistant from Ashenford, had grown into a confident and capable healer in her own right, now overseeing daily operations in the village, while Alira split her time between the healing center and her ongoing responsibilities in the capital. The arrangement had proven even more successful than either she or Cassian had initially hoped, creating genuine positive change throughout the kingdom, while allowing Alira to maintain the independence and purpose that had always defined her identity. Her relationship with Cassian had deepened steadily throughout the year, weathering occasional political complications and the ongoing challenge of balancing royal duties with personal connection, but growing stronger through each obstacle they faced together, rather than weaker. The court, largely won over by evidence of Alira's genuine value and dedication, had gradually shifted from skepticism to acceptance, and in many cases, genuine warmth toward the woman who had captured their king's heart so completely. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly identical in its golden light to that first evening on the castle balcony, when Cassian had proposed his careful courtship, that he requested Alira join him in the same garden his mother had once tended, now flourishing under years of careful cultivation that honored both the past and the future they continued building together. She found him waiting among the flowers, his expression carrying a nervous energy she rarely witnessed from someone typically so composed and controlled. Rose stood at a discreet distance near the garden entrance, and Alira noticed several other familiar faces gathered nearby as well, including Nathaniel and even Lady Eleanor, all positioned with careful casualness that suggested something significant had been planned. "Cassian," she said, approaching him with growing curiosity. "What's happening here?" He reached for her hands, his own trembling slightly, despite his obvious efforts to remain composed. "Alira Voss," he began, "1 year ago, you walked into my infirmary and refused everything I initially offered you, not once, but 3 separate times, each refusal teaching me something valuable about genuine character and unwavering commitment to values that matter." He knelt slowly before her, and Alira felt her breath catch as understanding dawned regarding what was unfolding in this quiet garden. "I promised myself I would never ask you to sacrifice your independence or your purpose for the sake of any position I might offer," he continued, his voice growing steadier despite the emotion evident in his expression. "This isn't an offer of resources or status or protection. This is simply a man asking the woman he loves completely to become his wife, his equal partner in building whatever future we create together." He produced a ring from within his jacket, simple in design, but clearly crafted with careful attention, unlike the elaborate jewelry typical of royal engagements. "Will you marry me, Alira? Not because it would benefit the kingdom strategically, not because circumstances demand it, but simply because I cannot imagine building my future with anyone other than you." Tears streamed freely down Alira's face as she looked at this man kneeling before her, the same man who had once commanded absolute authority, yet had never once tried to command her affection, choosing instead to earn it through patient, genuine partnership built on mutual respect. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Cassian, yes, I will marry you." The small gathering erupted into quiet celebration as Cassian rose and slipped the ring onto her finger, before pulling her into an embrace that spoke of everything they had built together over this remarkable year. Ro approached first, once the initial celebration settled, offering Alira a warm smile that carried genuine affection rather than his earlier careful assessment. "I told you, all those months ago, that no one had ever refused him before," Ro said. "I don't think either of us understood then just how significant that refusal would ultimately prove to be. I simply spoke honestly, Elira said, echoing words she had spoken so long ago during that first crisis in the infirmary. And that honesty changed everything, Ro replied. For him, certainly, but I believe for this entire kingdom as well. You've brought something to his leadership that strategic alliances and calculated positioning never could. Genuine understanding of what it means to serve people rather than simply rule them. As the evening deepened around them, filled with quiet celebration among close friends and advisors who had gradually become genuine supporters of their connection, Elira found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of that first desperate crisis, of Ro's whispered warning in the corridor, of every subsequent challenge they had faced and overcome together, through patient determination and unwavering honesty. She had turned down the Alpha King's offer 3 times, each refusal rooted not in rejection of him personally, but in her own steadfast commitment to values and purpose that mattered deeply to her sense of self. Rather than driving him away, those refusals had ultimately taught them both something essential about genuine partnership, about building connection, based on mutual respect, rather than simple acquisition or expectation. Standing in the garden his mother had once tended, surrounded by people who had witnessed their journey, and ultimately embraced the genuine love they had built together, Elira felt complete certainty about the future stretching ahead of them. Whatever challenges still awaited, political complications, or the ongoing balance between duty and personal happiness, she faced them now with unwavering confidence, secure in the knowledge that she and Cassian had built something far stronger than any calculated alliance could have provided. Cassian pulled her close once more, as evening settled fully into night, the garden lit by soft lanterns that cast warm light across flowers his mother had once carefully tended, a fitting symbol of new growth flourishing from careful cultivation and patient dedication. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for refusing me, and for eventually choosing me, on your own terms and in your own time." "Thank you," she replied, "for respecting those refusals, and for proving through every action, since that genuine love requires patience, understanding, and complete respect for the person you claim to cherish." As they stood together in that quiet garden, hearts fully open, and future secured through genuine love rather than calculated strategy, both understood that their story was only truly beginning, the foundation they had built together strong enough to support whatever chapters still remained unwritten in the years ahead. The healer who had once refused a king's every offer had ultimately given him something far more valuable than simple acceptance. She had given him genuine partnership, unwavering honesty, and a love built to last precisely because it had never demanded anything less than complete authenticity from either of them. And in that truth, both Elira and Cassian found the beginning of a future neither had ever dared to imagine, yet both now embraced completely, together, as equals, as partners, and finally, as 2 people who had found in each other exactly what they never knew they had been searching for all along.